Yama. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present this video as we head into NAIDOC Week 2021, once again in COVID lockdown to keep people safe. The Uniting Church in Australia has not had a perfect relationship with First Peoples. However, in recent decades, the Church has made a conscious effort to acknowledge its faults, to engage in truth-telling, and to take steps to reconcile and build relationships with First Peoples. We have taken some positive steps in the journey of reconciliation with First Peoples, but the journey is far from over, and we have much work still to do. To place the Uniting Church's relationship with First Peoples into context, I'll talk about some important events in the life of the Church. In 1985, the Uniting Church supported the establishment of the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress, often referred to as Congress, as a way of showing support for Aboriginal Christian peoples and supporting their ministry to their communities. The relationship between the Uniting Church and Congress continues today. However, like all long-term relationships, things haven't always run smoothly, and we must put work into the relationship to ensure it is a trusting and collaborative relationship as we move forward. In 1988, in an exercise of what we would today call truth-telling, the then President of the Uniting Church in Australia, Sir Ronald Wilson, issued a statement to the nation on behalf of the Church. The statement in part said, "At the same time, those of us who have migrated to Australia in the last 2 centuries, or are descendants of migrants, confess that all of us are beneficiaries of the injustices that have been inflicted on those of us who were Aboriginal people. In varying degrees, we all contribute to and perpetuate those injustices. We recognise the violence which has been done to Aboriginal people in the colonisation of this continent, and the injustice by which Aborigines have been deprived of the land. We recognise the continuing Aboriginal experience of violence and injustice. The integrity of our nation requires truth. The history of Australia, as it is taught in educational institutions or popularised in the media, must cease to conceal the reality and nature of Aboriginal society before invasion, what was done to them in colonisation, and what has been the fate and status of Aborigines within the Australian nation. The integrity of our nation will be measured by action, by legislative action which honours the Aboriginal plea for justice, and by popular action by which the Australian people express their willingness to support Aboriginal Australians in the quest for justice and their struggle to reconstruct their society. As for the Uniting Church in Australia, in obedience to God, in concern for the integrity of our nation, and in cooperation with all citizens of goodwill, we, Aboriginal and New Australians, have determined to stand together." 1988 was the bicentenary of the arrival of the First Fleet in Australia. For many First Peoples, the 26th of January does not represent a day of joy or happiness, but is rather a date that represents the commencement of an often brutal and oppressive colonisation process that saw many First Peoples dispossessed of their lands, placed in missions and other church institutions, forcibly separated from their families, and in some cases murdered and massacred. Understandably, Congress had asked the Uniting Church not to participate in the bicentenary celebrations, and the Church had in general agreed with this request. Unfortunately, some pockets of the Uniting Church did engage in celebrations of the bicentenary, and this, understandably, caused hurt for members of Congress. As a result of this situation, discussions were held between the Church and Congress over the following years, resulting in the Church issuing what we now know as the Covenant Statement in 1994. In 1994, the President of the Uniting Church Assembly, Dr. Jill Tabbott, read a covenant statement to the chairperson of the Uniting Aboriginal Islander Christian Congress. I will just read out a couple of paragraphs that was said by the President of the Uniting Church in 1994. "We recognise, as was declared in the Assembly's 1988 Statement to the Nation, that Australian people and this Church continue to benefit from the injustices done to your people over the past 2 centuries. We believe it is right for the Uniting Church to make reparations to you for land taken from your people and used by the churches which became part of this church." And then a little bit later, It is our desire to work in solidarity with the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress for the advancement of God's kingdom of justice and righteousness in this land, and we reaffirm the commitment made at the 1985 Assembly to do so. We want to bring discrimination to an end so that your people are no longer jailed in disproportionate numbers, so that equal housing, health, education and employment opportunities are available for your people as for ours. To that end, we commit ourselves to work with you towards national and state policy change. We commit ourselves to build understanding between your people and ours in every locality and to build relationships which respect the right of your people to self-determination in the church and in wider society. In 2009, the Uniting Church revised the preamble to its constitution to further recognise the relationship with First Peoples and its intention to continue to strengthen its relationship with First Peoples. I'll just read a few of the paragraphs from the revised preamble. Some members of the Uniting Churches approach the First Peoples with good intention, standing with them in the name of justice, considering their well-being, culture and language as the Churches proclaimed the reconciled purpose of the triune God found in the good news about Jesus Christ. Many in the Uniting Churches, however, shared the values and relationships of the emerging colonial society, including paternalism and racism towards First Peoples. They were complicit in the injustice and that resulted in many of the First Peoples being dispossessed from their land, their language, their culture and spirituality, becoming strangers in their own land. The Uniting Churches were largely silent as the dominant culture of Australia constructed and propagated a distorted version of history that denied this land was occupied, utilised, cultivated and harvested by these First Peoples, who also had complex systems of trade and interrelationships. As a result of this denial, relationships were broken and the very integrity of the gospel proclaimed by the churches was diminished. From the beginning of colonisation, the First Peoples challenged their dispossession and the denial of their proper place in this land. In time, this was taken up in the community, in the courts, in the parliaments, and in the way history was recorded and told, and in the Uniting Church in Australia. At the 2019 Assembly, the Assembly passed a resolution that acknowledged the sovereignty of First Peoples. The resolution reads as follows: Recognition of First Peoples as sovereign. In the light of A. The preamble to the Constitution of the Uniting Church, which defines sovereignty to be the way in which First Peoples understand themselves to be the traditional owners and custodians, and B. The statement from the heart's acknowledgement that sovereignty is a spiritual notion, reflecting the ancestral tie between the land and First Peoples. To affirm that First Peoples in Australia, the Aboriginal and Islander peoples, are sovereign peoples of this land. It's a wonderful, wonderful statement. So looking at the historical actions and statements by the Church, we can see a clear acknowledgement of the Church's role in past injustices that have impacted First Peoples. We can see the courage of the Uniting Church to engage in truth-telling and to acknowledge these wrongs. We can see a commitment of the Church to acknowledge the sovereignty and the right to self-determination of First Peoples, and we can see a commitment to walk together with First Peoples to address past wrongs and seek justice for First Peoples. It's a bit of a tongue twister. In 2019, the Synod of New South Wales and the ACT also endorsed the Makarrata proposal, put forward by the Reverend Dr. Amelia Coe-Butler and Reverend Dr. John Squires. The proposal encouraged members of the Church to engage with the statement from the heart and to consider First Peoples' calls for voice, treaty and truth. The rationale for the proposal included the following statement. In recognising its commitment to covenanting and reconciliation, the Uniting Church in New South Wales and the ACT seeks to further its call towards a reconciled future between First and Second Peoples. This proposal offers a way for intentional and meaningful engagement with the statement from the heart. The proposal invites the Church to consider the meaning and intent of the statement and its implications for Australia. Through public support for the statement, the Church is saying that it has listened to what was said at Uluru and recognises that it represents a legitimate and salient voice from First Nations peoples who have proposed a preferred way to a fairer and just society. I would encourage people to engage with the Makarrata proposal and the relevant learning resources mentioned in that proposal. Despite the various formal statements of commitment and acknowledgement and truth-telling by the Uniting Church, First Peoples still face significant socio-economic disadvantage as a result of the legacy of colonisation, dispossession, and the policies and practices of past governments. The calls for voice, treaty, truth remain effectively unanswered by the Australian government. Aboriginal people continue to die in custody from preventable causes, and the recommendations from the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody are yet to be fully and effectively implemented. Aboriginal people continue to die in custody. When I think of this situation, I can't help but think of the second greatest commandment: love your neighbour as you love yourself. And the Good Samaritan story, where Jesus explains to us who our neighbour is. As a church, we must acknowledge that First Peoples are our neighbours. We must acknowledge that First Peoples remain injured at the side of the road, and that we must not simply walk past. We must stop, we must help, and we must help them as we would like to be helped in our time of need. So what can we do? I'd encourage people to undertake learning about Australia's First Peoples and about the impact of colonisation on First Peoples. Learn about the doctrine of terra nullius and how this doctrine was unlawfully applied to the Australian continent as a justification for the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples from their ancestral lands. Learn about the stolen generations and the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families. Learn about the frontier wars and the many massacres of Aboriginal peoples that occurred. Learn about the overrepresentation of Aboriginal peoples in jail and juvenile justice centres, and about deaths in custody. Learn not to feel guilty or responsible for the past, as we cannot change what has already occurred, but learn so that you can be empowered through knowledge to effect positive change in the future. Learn so that you can stand in solidarity with First Peoples and call for justice where injustices have occurred. Learn so that you can educate others and so that you can help to address the racism and prejudice that arises from ignorance. There are some learning resources on the First Nations Resources webpage on the Synod website, so I would encourage people, if you're not sure where to start, to look at the Synod website. And also please keep your eyes out for the Walking Together Action Plan that is currently being considered by the 2021 Synod meeting. Hopefully, if that document is approved, it will be available on the Synod webpage later in the year. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. There's lots still to be done, and I thank you for your support for First Peoples as we move forward. Thank you very much.